The night the thermometer outside dropped below 40 below zero, Astrid Valen did not pray. She did not weep. She pulled on her second pair of wool socks, lit the oil lamp with hands that had stopped trembling 3 days ago, and walked out into the dark. The cold that met her at the door was not like ordinary cold. It was not the cold of a winter morning when you step outside and feel the air nip at your ears and cheeks. This was something denser, more deliberate, the kind of cold that had weight and intention that pressed against every exposed inch of skin and meant to stay. Her exhaled breath did not drift. It crystallized and fell a faint shimmer of ice that caught the lamplight for just a moment before disappearing into the snow at her feet. The birch trees in the north woodlot were cracking in the dark, not bending, not groaning, cracking. Rifle shot sounds that carried across the flat white fields with nothing to slow them, each one sharp and sudden and final. She crossed the yard in 30 steps. Her boots found the path she had worn into the snow over weeks of the same route. She reached the woodshed, set the lamp on the ledge inside the door, and moved 3 rows of split birch to the left. Her hands knew the work. They did not need the light. She found the leather pull strap beneath the 3rd row, lifted the hatch, and felt the air rise to meet her face. Warm. Not warm the way a fire is warm. Warm the way the earth is warm. Cool to a summer hand, but against the killing weight of a Minnesota January, at 40 below it rose like something alive, like something waiting for her. She climbed down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall the previous September and stood at the bottom with her bare palm held at chest height. She counted to 10, then she made her estimate. 41 degrees, maybe 42, outside 40 below zero. Below the firewood shed, in a space that nobody in the Crow Wing Valley knew existed, winter was a rumor, a story you might hear from someone else. Nothing more than that. She stood there for a moment in the lamplight. She looked at the burlap sacks of potatoes, the crocks of salted pork sealed with rendered fat, the jars of pickled beets standing in their careful rows, the cedar box holding the cornmeal that had to stay dry or become useless. She looked at all of it, and none of it had shifted. None of it had frozen. None of it had failed. Then she thought of her father. She thought of a stone staircase in Telemark, Norway, in the autumn of 1908. She had been 9 years old. The surface of the ground had already begun to stiffen under the first serious frost of the season, but 6 feet below the old smokehouse foundation, the air held steady at just above 40 degrees. She had not understood what that number meant, yet not in any practical sense. But she had felt the warmth rising to meet her face as she climbed down, and she had watched her father crouch beside a row of wax-sealed crocks, his breath barely visible in the lamplight, his palm pressed flat against the stone wall. He had said the earth remembers summer longer than we do. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that, you stop fighting winter. You start borrowing what the ground already has. She had filed it away, a lesson without a test, a fact that sat in the back of her mind for 21 years, gathering dust in a corner she rarely visited, until now. She climbed back up, replaced the hatch, restacked the birch, and walked to the house to make supper. The cracking of the trees followed her across the yard. She did not look back. Astrid Valen Thoresen, before her marriage, had come to Minnesota from the Telemark region of Norway in the spring of 1924. She had come with her husband, Torsten Valen, following a letter from a cousin in Brainerd who described the land prices in measured terms in the growing season and cautious ones. The cousin had been honest enough not to oversell it. He had not mentioned the winters, but then the winters were the kind of thing you had to experience to understand, and no honest description of them would have sounded believable to someone who had not yet lived through one. Torsten had found the property first. 80 acres along a tributary of the Crow Wing River, 2 miles east of a crossroads settlement that had a general store, a grain elevator, a Lutheran church, and not much else. Timber on the north slope, hay ground in the low spots, a creek that ran clear most of the year. The farmhouse was small and drafty, built by a previous owner, without enough attention to the direction of the prevailing wind, but the bones of it were sound. Torsten had walked the fence lines twice and decided it was honest land. He had shaken the seller's hand on a Thursday afternoon and they had moved in by Sunday. Astrid had looked at the land differently than Torsten did. He looked for what it could produce. She looked for how it behaved. She watched the way frost moved across the low-lying hay ground in the mornings, retreating first from the elevated areas and clinging longest to the creek bends. She watched the way the snow settled on the north slope, building in layers, and how it melted on the south-facing rise behind the house 2 full weeks before anywhere else on the property. She watched the way the woodshed in the northeast corner of the lot, backed against a low ridge that broke the prevailing northwest wind, stayed dry and still on mornings when the rest of the farmyard was swept and drifted and loud. Torsten noticed what the land grew. Astrid noticed how the land breathed. This was not a difference that caused friction between them. It was simply a difference, the kind that made two people more useful together than either would be alone. Torsten could build and calculate and judge a crop yield by looking at a field for 30 seconds. Astrid could read a piece of ground the way some people read a face, picking up signals that did not announce themselves, processing information that arrived without a label. They were a good match, not a romantic story the way people sometimes need a story to be all trembling and speechlessness and overflowing feeling. A good match, steady and mutual and built on the understanding that the work mattered, that the land required their full attention, and that anything worth doing was worth doing with the same competence every single day. The first 2 years were hard in the way that first years on new land always hard. There were expenses that came faster than income, equipment that needed replacing, soil that needed to be understood before it would perform. Torsten built the woodshed in their second season, a solid structure 18 feet wide, and 12 deep cedar shakes on the roof open on the south side where the wood was loaded and pulled. He built it with the back wall tucked hard against the ridge, which was practical thinking, breaking the wind before it could strip the heat from the stacked wood. Astrid watched him choose the location and said nothing because it was the right location, and adding words to a right decision is just noise. The root cellar they inherited from the previous owner was dug into the hillside behind the house. It was 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, walled in fieldstone, roofed in rough-cut lumber under 2 feet of banked earth. It had worked well enough for whoever built it. For Astrid, it worked until the winter of 1927, and then it stopped working, and the difference between those two conditions was everything. 3 weeks of cold in January of 1927. Not the worst cold Astrid had experienced on that land, not the sustained, grinding, record-setting cold that would come 4 years later, but a cold snap that set in and held day after day without the usual mid-afternoon softening that gave the ground a chance to recover. By the end of the second week, the temperature inside the old root cellar had dropped to 22 degrees. By the end of the third week, she had lost 100 pounds of potatoes, 3 crocks of pickled cabbage, and most of her dried apple stores. She and Torsten stood in the ruined cellar with a lamp between them, looking at the damage. Torsten said it was a bad year, an unusual cold snap, that it would not happen often. Astrid did not argue with him. She simply began in the private way she processed most things to consider the problem as a problem that needed a solution rather than as an event that needed to be accepted. The following spring, Astrid went to see Oswald Fjellstad. Oswald was a third-generation Norwegian farmer who worked a quarter section 3 miles east on ground that had been in his family since his grandfather homesteaded it in 1881. He was a man in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that comes from 40 years of physical work. He did not waste effort. He did not waste words. He stopped his wagon at her lane occasionally, the way farmers in that valley did when they had been alone with their thoughts all week and the road went past a neighbor's lane at a reasonable hour. Astrid respected him, not because he was older, not because he was a man, not for any reason that had to do with category. She respected him because he knew things and the things he knew were useful, and he did not pretend to know things he did not know. That last quality was rarer than most people understood. She walked to his farm on a May morning when the fields were soft with new growth and asked him directly had his root cellar ever failed. He looked at her for a moment without answering. Then he said yes, twice, 1919 and 1923. Both bad winters, both long cold snaps, both ended the same way. The cellar went below freezing by the second week, and he lost most of what he had stored. Astrid asked, did his father's cellar in Norway ever fail? Oswald was quiet for longer this time. He turned his hat in his hands. Then he said slowly, as though the memory was something he had to locate rather than something sitting on the surface. His father's cellar never failed. Not in any winter his father could remember. And his grandfather's cellar, the original one built into the hillside on the home farm in Telemark, had never failed either. Not once, not in 60 years of use. Astrid asked him why. He said my father dug deeper, and he chose ground that had never been turned. He said it the way you say something you have always known, but never organized into a sentence before. As though the knowledge had been sitting inside him his whole life, but the question had never arrived to pull it out. Astrid nodded once and thanked him and walked the 3 miles home. The thing she understood walking back through the new green fields of that May morning was not simply that the old cellar was too shallow. She understood something larger. She understood that every farm in the Crow Wing Valley was using the same design, the same depth, the same basic approach to underground storage, because that was how it had always been done in this part of Minnesota, because the early settlers had built the first ones and the later arrivals had copied them, and no one had stopped to ask whether the original design was actually correct or simply the first one anyone had thought of. A wrong design repeated often enough becomes tradition. Tradition becomes assumption. Assumption becomes the thing you do not question because it is the thing that has always been done. The whole valley was wrong, not through negligence, not through stupidity, simply through the accumulated momentum of doing what the people before you had done without asking whether the people before you had done it correctly. Astrid had asked, now she needed to think. She thought for 2 more years before she acted. She did not think constantly. She turned the problem over occasionally the way you turn a stone in your hand while doing something else, not examining it directly, but keeping it present. She watched the property through 2 full winters. She paid attention to the places where the snow melted and the places where it did not. She paid attention to the frozen ground in the farmyard and how deep the freeze went in different spots. She took a steel rod and pushed it into the earth in various locations on cold February mornings, noting how far it went before hitting the resistance of frozen soil. Under the woodshed, the rod stopped at a depth that surprised her. Not because the ground there was frozen, because it was not. At a point where every other location on the property had frozen solid to a depth of 3 feet or more, the ground under the woodshed had frozen no deeper than 18 inches. She stood over the hole she had made with the rod and thought about why. The answer took a few minutes to fully assemble, but when it did, it assembled clearly. The woodshed roof protected the ground from direct snow cover, but more importantly, it reduced the rate at which surface temperatures penetrated downward. The ridge behind the shed blocked the prevailing northwest wind, reducing the sustained cold that stripped heat from the surface. The floor of the shed, packed earth that had never been turned, was dense and compact with a lower moisture content than the tilled soil of the fields, which meant it conducted cold downward more slowly. And somewhere below the 7-foot mark, she suspected there was a shelf of stone that did not conduct cold at all in any meaningful way on the timescale of a single winter. The ground under the woodshed was not frozen deep because the woodshed had been for 20-some years protecting it. The soil there had banked the heat of the summer before and was releasing it slowly insulated from the worst of the winter above by layers of air and roof and packed earth that slowed the transfer of cold to a pace winter could not match. She had not guessed this. She had observed it over 2 full winters and followed the observation to its conclusion. In September of 1929, she went to Torsten and told him she wanted to dig under the woodshed. Torsten did not get the chance to respond. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, he came in from the field, pale and bent at the waist, one hand pressed against his right side. By Friday, it was clear something inside him had failed. The nearest doctor was 20 miles away, on roads that were adequate in good conditions. The conditions that summer were not good. The doctor arrived on Saturday morning. Torsten was 34 years old. He had not been sick a day in the 10 years Astrid had known him. He had never missed a morning's work for any reason she could remember. He died on a Saturday in the bedroom of the farmhouse he had built with his own hands on land he had judged to be honest and worked with a consistency that deserved better than what it got. Astrid was 31 years old. She had no family within 1,000 miles, no savings to spare after the years of establishing the property, no practical reason to leave, and no means to do so if she had one. She had 80 acres along a tributary of the Crow Wing River, a horse named Duke, a dairy cow named Stella, a woodshed full of split birch, and a root cellar that had proven twice that it would fail her when she needed it most. She buried Torsten on the south-facing rise behind the house where the snow melted first. She kept the gravestone simple. His name, the years, nothing else because nothing else was needed. A man like Torsten was defined by what he had built and how he had worked, and the farm standing around that stone said more than any inscription could. Then she waited until September when the surface ground was still workable, and she began to dig. She had marked out the dimensions in her mind before she put a spade in the earth. 9 feet by 14 in the back half of the shed beneath the rows of stacked birch. She waited until the first week of September when the air already carried the particular edge of coming cold, but the ground had not yet stiffened. She started with a long-handled spade. The first foot came up easy, dark topsoil smelling of roots and autumn rain light and workable. The second foot was heavier, dense clay-laced subsoil that came up in dark clods and smelled of iron the way deep earth smells when it has not seen light in decades. By the third foot, she had switched to a mattock, breaking the hard pan in short, measured swings, loading the spoil into the wheelbarrow by lamplight in the early morning and by the last of the afternoon light when the days were short. She walked 30 yards out to dump in a low spot at the edge of the hayfield, then walked back, then swung the mattock again. 3 hours in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 11 days of pale September light. When Oswald Fjellstad stopped his wagon at the edge of her lane on the third day and looked at the displaced earth and the stacked creek stone and the wheelbarrow tracks worn into the yard, he sat for a moment without speaking. Then he asked if she was building something. Improving the storage, she said. He looked at the mound of subsoil at the field's edge. He looked at the stack of flat creek stone she had been collecting since July, hauled in the wagon over 3 separate trips. He was a man who understood earthwork and could read a project from its byproducts. He did not say anything further that day. He drove on. He came back 2 days later on a Saturday morning and asked if she could use a second pair of hands for an hour. She said she could. He worked without questions for the rest of the morning, moving stone and wheelbarrow loads of spoil with the steady, unhurried efficiency of a man who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to hold a tool. He went home at noon and came back the following Saturday and did the same thing. He never asked what the dimensions were for or why she had chosen that location or what she intended to put down there. He could see she knew what she was doing. Asking would have been unnecessary. On the day she had reached the depths she needed, 9 feet of clear excavation walls cut plumb, floor leveled flat, she stood at the bottom in the lamplight and held her hand at shoulder height and felt nothing but still, cool, earth-smelling air. She estimated the temperature at 43 degrees. The surface outside was already dropping below freezing at night. That was when she finally explained it to Oswald, who was standing at the top of the pit looking down at her. She told him what she had noticed about this particular ground over 5 years of watching it. She told him about the depth of freeze in different parts of the property. She told him about the stone shelf she had confirmed at just below the 7-foot mark, a layer of granite-edged fieldstone that sat like a table under the clay, holding its temperature so slowly across a season that no Minnesota winter had the months required to cool it to freezing. She told him that the woodshed roof above this pit would now serve two purposes: to store firewood and to insulate the ground beneath it from the worst of the cold above. Oswald listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have dug deeper." He said it simply, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact he has arrived at honestly. Not a complaint, not an excuse, just an acknowledgement. "Astrid said you didn't know. None of us knew. The whole valley has been doing it wrong." Oswald was quiet again. Then he said, "How deep did your father go in Norway?" She thought of the stone staircase in Telemark, the smell of limestone and packed earth, the warmth rising to meet her face at 9 years old. She said, "Deep enough." The walls she lined with flat fieldstone, collected from the creek bank over 3 months of summer work. 160 pounds of it fitted tight against the earth walls without mortar, coarse sand tamped into the gaps. Stone against earth, earth surrounding stone. She had spent enough time in her father's cellar to understand what was happening. When you did this, the stone did not just sit there. It absorbed heat through the long warmth of the summer and the autumn, drawing it in slowly and holding it the way a cast iron pan holds heat long after it leaves the fire. Underground, separated from the freezing air above by 9 feet of earth, and a roof and a stack of firewood, those walls would give back that stored warmth through the winter at a rate so slow that no single night, no single week, not even 9 consecutive days of record cold could overcome it. Her father had known this. His father before him had known it. It was not a discovery. It was a recovery. She was not inventing anything. She was remembering something that the settlement of this valley had forgotten, because no one had asked why the old way worked, only copied it until the copy became the standard, and the original reasoning was lost. The floor she treated with equal care. Packed earth leveled smooth, covered first with 3 inches of coarse washed sand. Over the sand she laid a second course of stones, smaller flat pieces, each one heated in a sustained bonfire she built at the field's edge, and carried wrapped in burlap while still warm, walking quickly across the yard with her arms full of heat. 200 pounds of field stone sitting 9 feet below the surface, laid warm, would not surrender that warmth in a single season. They would release it degree by degree, the same slow arithmetic of thermal mass. The roof required the most thought. 6-inch rough sawn pine planks across the 9-foot span, supported at center by a beam set into notches cut into the stone walls. Over the planks, 4 inches of the driest hay from last summer's cutting, layered dense and compressed by hand. Over the hay, a sheet of waxed canvas salvaged from an old grain-covered edges, overlapping a full foot and tucked down against the stones. Over the canvas, 12 inches of subsoil pressed into a low arch by her hands and feet, smoothed until it looked like undisturbed ground. Then she stacked the birch back over it. Every split piece returned to exactly where it had been. The rows neat and ordinary. The hatch concealed beneath the third row from the right, a 2-foot square of pine planks with a leather pull strap, invisible, unless you moved the wood and knew what you were looking for. To anyone loading or pulling firewood from that shed, nothing had changed. The floor looked solid. The wood sat in its ordinary rows. The structure was the same building it had always been, in the same corner of the same property. The woodshed was still just a woodshed. That, too, was part of the design. Oswald Fjellstad stood outside the shed after she had replaced the last of the birch and looked at it for a long moment. He said, "You'd never know." That was the point, she said. He nodded once. He understood it the way practical men understand practical things, completely and without requiring further elaboration. In the last days of September, she lowered into the pit by lamplight. 140 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks, 60 pounds of turnips, 4 crocks of salted pork sealed with rendered fat, 11-quart jars of pickled beets and cabbage, 2 crocks of lard, a 50-pound sack of cornmeal inside the cedar box fitted with a tight lid, and a tin holding $40 in paper money wrapped twice in oilcloth. Everything she would need to survive a hard winter without leaving the property or spending a dollar she did not have. October hardened. November came in gray and serious, the birch dropping their leaves in a rush, the fields going from amber to gray to white in less than 2 weeks. The Crow-Wing tributary froze over in the second week of November, which was early even by local standards. Astrid spent the darkening afternoons of late autumn recalking the north wall of the house, oiling every piece of leather tack in the barn, splitting the last of her summer-cut wood, and building the pile under the shed to a full 4 cords. The winter of 1929 into 1930 was a moderate one. Cold the way Minnesota winters are always cold, hard enough to demand respect, but without the particular sustained fury that separates the winters people talk about for the rest of their lives from the winters that simply pass. Astrid checked the pit twice in December and twice in January. It held steady between 39 and 42 degrees throughout. The lard was firm, the potatoes solid, the jars uncracked. She pulled from it as needed through the season and replaced nothing, and by March she still had most of what she had put in. She was not satisfied by this. Satisfaction required a test, and that winter was not a test. That winter was confirmation of the design principle. The real test would require conditions that her calculation had been built to withstand, conditions she had not yet faced. In December of 1930, the thermometer outside her north porch dropped to 14 below zero on a clear, still morning, with a sky the particular shade of blue that only comes with high pressure in extreme cold. She walked to the woodshed, moved aside the birch, lifted the hatch, and climbed down. She held her bare hand at chest height and counted to 10. 41 degrees, maybe 42. Outside 14 below. Inside, the stored warmth of the previous summer was doing precisely what she had designed it to do. She climbed back out, replaced the hatch, stacked the birch, and walked to the house. The thermometer read 14 below all day. By evening, it had not moved. The real test was still coming. She did not know yet how severe it would be, but she had built the thing that was going to meet it, and the thing was ready, and so was she. The Arctic Ridge arrived without announcement on the 14th of January, 1931, the way the worst things always arrive, not with drama, not with warning, simply with a shift in the quality of the air overnight, a new weight to it, a new intention, and a thermometer reading at first light that Astrid looked at twice before she accepted what it said. 29 below zero. She stood on the north porch in her coat and boots and looked at the number on the thermometer and then looked at the sky, clear, pale, a blue so thin and hard it looked like something that could shatter. No clouds to the north, no movement, no indication that the pressure system sitting over the valley intended to go anywhere. The birch trees in the north woodlot stood perfectly still, not a branch moving. The wind had stopped sometime in the night and left behind a cold that was absolute and structural, the kind that does not gust or fluctuate but simply exists, pressed down over the land like a hand. She went back inside and made coffee and listened to 30 minutes of the battery radio. The forecast was brief. An Arctic high-pressure ridge had locked over northern Minnesota. Temperatures would remain well below zero through the weekend. The broadcaster did not say for how long. He said the system showed no signs of movement. Astrid turned the radio off and finished her coffee and went to the barn. Stella was standing at the hay rack, which was the first thing she checked every morning. An animal that would not stand, would not eat, was an animal in trouble. Stella was eating with the deliberate rhythmic steadiness of a contented cow, and the barn temperature, when Astrid checked the thermometer nailed to the center post, read 18 above. Cold for a barn, not dangerous, not yet. She broke the skim of ice on the water trough with the butt of the hammer she kept hanging on the post nail. For exactly that purpose, carried 2 buckets of warm water from the kitchen range and poured them in. Stella drank without hesitation. Duke moved in his stall with the contained restlessness of a horse that wanted out, but understood the weather well enough to stay. She forked hay into both their racks, checked the hinges on the barn door for the stiffening that came with deep cold, and walked back to the house. By the following morning, it was 33 below. The thermometer's red column had retreated another 4 degrees overnight with the same quiet certainty that the whole system was demonstrating. No drama, just arithmetic. Just cold deepening into cold with no floor in sight. The cold that came down from Canada in those first days of the third week of January 1931 was not the cold of a hard winter. It was the cold of a season that had decided to demonstrate what it was actually capable of, given sufficient time and absence of mercy. By the 17th, the morning reading was 38 below zero. At that temperature, the physics of the world change in ways that are visible and strange. Exhaled breath does not drift. It crystallizes in the air directly in front of your face and falls. Exposed skin loses sensation in under 5 minutes. Metal burns to the touch. Rubber shatters like glass. The sap inside living trees expands faster than the wood can hold, and the trees speak about it in the night with sounds like rifle shots that carry across the frozen fields and reach the bedroom window. The crow-winged tributary, frozen solid since November, groaned under the new pressure of cold driving deeper into its ice. The creek a quarter-mile east made no sound at all. It had gone entirely silent under a silence that felt like the silence of something that had given up. Astrid ran the house on 3 fires. The kitchen range fed twice in the morning, and once at midday and once in the late afternoon. The parlor stove twice a day, no more, because she was burning through wood faster than she had planned for, and March was still 6 weeks away. The small box stove in the bedroom kept barely breathing overnight to prevent the water bucket from turning to a block of ice by morning. She rationed with the precision of a woman who understood exactly how much wood she had and exactly how many days remained in a Minnesota winter and what the margin between those two numbers was. She was not comfortable, but she was not in danger. There was a difference, and she kept the difference clearly in mind. The barn was a different calculation. Board and batten construction from their first year on the property, built quickly with what they could afford, insulated only by its own walls and whatever warmth the animals generated between them. In ordinary winters, it was sufficient. In cold snaps of 4 or 5 days' duration, the barn temperature dropped but held above the danger threshold for a mature animal with good winter condition. Astrid had managed this before. She checked the barn thermometer every morning and every evening and kept her firewood allocations accordingly. On the morning of January 18th, the barn thermometer read 11 above. She stood in front of it for a moment and did the subtraction. 2 days ago, it had been 18 above. The barn had lost 7 degrees in 48 hours, which meant the building was no longer holding pace with the cold outside. The cold was winning degree by degree, and at 11 above the margin was still workable but no longer comfortable. She increased Stella's hay ration. She carried an extra bucket of warm water. She stood in the barn for longer than necessary that morning, watching the animals breathing, reading posture and movement, with the eye of a woman who had learned to read animals the same way she learned to read ground, by watching them closely for a long time without assuming she already knew what she was seeing. Everything was still manageable. She went back to the house. On the morning of the 5th day, Astrid heard boots on the porch steps before she heard the knock. She knew the sound of those steps before the knock came. The weight and the rhythm of them, the way they came up the 3 steps without hesitation, without the tentative quality of a stranger's approach. She had heard those steps at her door a handful of times over the years, always with a purpose, never without one. She opened the door before the second knock. Oswald Fjellstad stood on her porch with his hat in his hands. He was wearing every layer a man could reasonably wear and still move in, and even so the cold had gotten through to him in some visible way, in the color of his face, in the set of his jaw, and something behind his eyes that she had not seen there before. He was not a man who asked for things. He had not been a man who asked for things in the entire time she had known him. The cost of what he was about to say was apparent in the way he was standing, holding his hat in both hands and not looking directly at her. He said, "My cellar went under on the third day." She said nothing. She let him finish. He said, "I lost the potatoes, the salted pork, most of the cabbage. I have enough flour and cornmeal to manage, but I am short on what I need to carry through March." He stopped. He had said everything there was to say, and he understood that she had heard all of it, and so he waited. Astrid looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in out of the cold." He came in. He stood in her kitchen without sitting down, still holding his hat, while she put on her coat and her second pair of wool socks and her boots. She did not offer him coffee first. She did not ask him to wait. She went directly to the woodshed, and he followed her across the yard in the killing cold 38 below, the air crystallizing around every exhaled breath, the snow under their boots making the particular high-pitched squeak that only comes at extreme temperatures. She moved the birch. She lifted the hatch. The warm air rose into the cold of the shed and was visible for just a moment, the temperature differential making it briefly dense before it was absorbed and was gone. She climbed down and came back up with a burlap sack of potatoes 40 pounds, a crock of salted pork, 2 jars of pickled cabbage sealed tight with their wax and cloth tops. She carried them one at a time up the 8 steps and set them on the shed floor. Then she replaced the hatch, stacked the birch back into its rows, and stood up and looked at Oswald. His face had a quality she had not seen on it before. He was looking at the ordinary surface of the woodshed floor, at the stacked birch and the undisturbed slab of packed earth, at the thing that was completely invisible because she had built it to be completely invisible, and he was working through the full implication of what he had just witnessed. He said quietly, more to himself than to her, "It held." "Yes," she said. He picked up the sack and the crock and held out one arm for the jars. She set them in the crook of his elbow. He carried them to his wagon with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying things that now meant the difference between the rest of the winter and something worse. He tied them down. He turned back to face her across the yard. He said, "I owe you." She said, "You helped me dig it. Consider the debt settled." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, put his hat back on his head, and drove east toward his property through the white and the cold. She watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend. Then she went back inside. The 6th day, the 7th, the temperatures held. Each morning Astrid rose before light, made her fire dressed in every layer she owned that still permitted her to move freely, and went through the rounds that the property required. Barn first, then the house, then the wood. Then the barn again at midday, at dusk, in the early dark of 7 in the evening, when the cold outside had settled to its daily low, and the stars over the valley were so bright and hard, they looked like holes cut in the sky. The barn thermometer was the one she watched most carefully. It had dropped to 9 above on the 6th morning, and on the 7th, it read 9 above still, which meant the building had reached its equilibrium in this cold, the rate of heat loss equaling the rate of heat generated by 2 large animals in an enclosed space, and it was holding. Cold, uncomfortable, still workable for a mature animal in good condition. On the morning of the 9th day, she pulled the barn door open and felt the difference before she saw the thermometer. It was not the temperature itself that told her first. Temperature takes a moment to read on skin that is already cold from the walk across the yard. It was the quality of the air inside the building, the particular stillness of air that has gone too cold, dense, and flat, without the faint animal warmth that a barn always carries when its occupants are well. The smell was different too subtly, the way a room smells different when the people in it have been under strain. The thermometer read 7 above. She turned to look at Stella. The cow was standing at the far wall with her head lowered, not eating. Her weight was shifted forward onto her front legs in a way that was not her ordinary posture. Her breathing was coming in shallow pulls, audible in the stillness of the barn, shorter than it should have been. When Astrid crossed to her and pressed her palm flat against the cow's flank, the warmth she felt there was thinner than it should have been. Not absent, but thin. the body pulling its resources inward away from the surface, conserving the core temperature at the cost of the periphery. Astrid ran both hands down Stella's near foreleg from knee to hoof. The leg was cold from the mid-cannon down, not frostbitten, not yet, but cold in a way that told her the animal circulation was working hard to maintain what mattered most, and had begun to sacrifice what it could spare. She crouched beside the cow and pressed her hands together inside her gloves and began to think. It was when she was crouching there, her left hand resting against Stella's flank, that she noticed what she had somehow not noticed in weeks of caring for this animal through the cold snap. She pressed her palm more firmly against the curve of the cow's belly, moved it forward, pressed again. She sat back on her heels. Stella was carrying a calf. 6 weeks, perhaps, a little less. The calf was there present, generating its own small warmth inside the cow that had been sustaining them both through 9 days of record cold on a barn thermometer that had now reached 7 above. Astrid understood immediately what this meant. Not just Stella's life, not just a calf. The calf meant milk the following spring. It meant a season's income from what Stella produced. It meant butter and cheese, and the cash that the surplus brought at the general store. It meant the difference between a self-sufficient spring and a spring spent watching every dollar. The calf that Stella was carrying through this cold was not a sentimental concern. It was the economic foundation of the next 12 months on this property. She stood up. She looked at the shed 30 feet away, through the gap in the barn door she had not yet closed. She looked at the east wall of the barn and the west wall of the shed 4 feet apart, a gap that she and Torsten had talked about closing in their second year on the property and had never gotten to. She did not go inside and deliberate. She went to the rafters of the shed and pulled down 4 lengths of rough-sawn 2x6 she had stored there for future use. She took the remaining wax canvas from the hook on the shed's interior wall. She found the spool of baling wire, the hammer, the box of 8-penny nails. She brought both of the loose hay bales down from the barn loft, cut the twine, and opened them into full loose mass. She built a barrier across the 4-foot gap between the two structures in the way that a practical person in an emergency builds anything not with the ideal materials in the ideal configuration, but with whatever is at hand assembled to solve the specific problem as directly as possible. The hay bales compressed and stacked to fill the gap's width. The canvas stretched over and around them and nailed into the wooden wall frames on both sides. The 2x6s braced diagonally across the outside face to hold the whole assembly against the wind that came around the north end of the ridge in sustained flat gusts. Her fingers went numb twice during the work. Both times she stopped and pressed them against the side of Stella's neck, standing in the small warmth the cow was still generating, holding her hands there against the animal's pulse until the joints came back enough to grip a hammer. The work took an hour and 20 minutes. She did not hurry because hurrying causes mistakes, and mistakes in that cold cost more than time. She worked steadily and methodically, and when it was done, she stood back and looked at what she had built. It was not elegant. It was not a wall. It was hay and canvas and diagonal lumber and baling wire assembled in the gap between two structures by a woman working alone at 7 above zero in the 9th day of the worst cold snap in 20 years. But it was sufficient. The distinction between elegant and sufficient in the conditions that existed that morning was not a distinction worth making. What she had done was not add heat. She had no means of adding heat to the barn, no safe fire possible in a board and batten structure, no source she could use. What she had done was reduce the rate at which cold entered. She had sealed the gap that the northwest wind had been driving through, like a funnel stripping the residual warmth from the barn air faster than the animals could replace it. She had added insulation to the most exposed face of the most vulnerable wall. She had bought degrees without burning a stick of wood. The mathematics of insulation are not complicated once you understand them. Every gap sealed is a loss prevented. Every layer added between an animal and a sustained wind at 34 below is degrees recovered at no fuel cost. You are not fighting the cold, you are simply slowing its entry. You are making it work harder to take what it wants, and in that additional effort, time passes. And while time passes, the cold front inches east and the pressure ridge weakens. And somewhere to the north, the Arctic air that has been sitting over your valley begins imperceptibly at first to move. By midday, she estimated the barn had risen to 13 above. Stella was standing squarely on all four legs. She had moved to the hay rack on her own and was eating with the slow, deliberate steadiness that was her ordinary manner. Her breathing had deepened. The shallow pulling quality was gone. Astrid carried 2 buckets of hot water from the kitchen range, walking quickly across the yard with her arms wrapped around them to hold the heat against the cold that was trying to pull it away. Stella drank both buckets in long, unhurried pulls. By evening, the thermometer inside the barn read 14 above. Stella was standing easy. Duke moved in his stall with the ordinary restlessness of a horse who had been inside too long and wanted to remind someone of that fact. Astrid went back to the house. She was descending the steps into the pit on the evening of the 7th day when the lamp caught the east wall at an angle she had not used before. She stopped on the 4th step. She held the lamp higher and looked at what the light was showing her. In the east wall, 2 feet below the top of the stone course, and perhaps a foot to the right of where the wall met the earth, there was something that did not belong to what she had built. The stones around it were hers, fitted and tamped the previous September. But behind and between 2 of them, driven into the raw earth face beneath the stone course, was the head of a pickaxe. Old. The metal so thoroughly rusted that it had taken on the red-brown color of the surrounding clay and nearly disappeared into it. The handle was gone, rotted out of the eye entirely. Nothing remaining of it but a soft, dark stain in the soil where wood had been and was no longer. And beside it, wedged at an angle into the same undisturbed earth, a leather boot, small, a child's size. The leather had gone stiff and cracked and darkened past its original color, but the shape was still recognizable. The sole was still attached. The lacing holes were still there, though no lace remained. Astrid stood on the 4th step for a long moment without moving. Someone had been digging here before her. Someone had reached this depth or close to it in the same ground beneath the same structure, or whatever had stood here before the shed Torsten built. Someone had understood the same principles she had understood, had chosen the same location for the same reasons, had begun the same work, and had not finished it. She did not know the name. She did not know the year. She did not know what had stopped the work. She only knew standing in the lamplight, 9 feet below the firewood shed, with her bare hands still registering the steady warmth of the earth around her, that she was not the first person to have understood this. She was the first person who had understood it and lived long enough and held together well enough and refused to stop when stopping would have been the reasonable thing to do. She reached out and put her hand on the pickaxe head. The metal was cold, the same cold as the stone beside it. She left it where it was. She left the boot where it was. She did not move them, did not remove them, did not disturb the position they had held for however many years they had been there. Whoever had left them there had known something worth knowing. They had carried the knowledge to this ground and started the work. They had left these things in the earth like a sentence that had never been finished. She had finished it. She climbed back up, replaced the hatch, stacked the birch back into its rows, and crossed the yard to the house. The radio the next morning said what she had been waiting to hear. The pressure ridge was showing movement. The Arctic air mass had begun to shift northeast overnight. Temperatures would remain severely below 0 through that day and possibly the following morning. But the forecast for the 23rd was 15 below, and after that the system would begin to break. She turned the radio off. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the wall. 9 days, 9 consecutive days of temperatures that had reached 38 below at their lowest, sustained and unrelenting, the kind of cold that the valley had not seen in 2 decades, and that nobody on the surrounding properties had been built to withstand at its full force. 9 days during which the fruit of everything she had thought about and worked toward and built with her own hands had been tested against the worst that the weather could offer. The pit had not moved. The stone walls had given back their stored warmth with the indifference of geology degree by degree, without asking anything in return, without requiring attention or fuel or management. The system had simply done what it had been designed to do, which was the only thing any system at its best could ever do. The barn had been harder. The barn had tested her in a different way, tested her ability to read a problem while it was still manageable and respond before it became something else. She had not saved Stella through brilliance. She had saved her through attention and the willingness to act on what attention revealed to build an imperfect solution quickly rather than wait for a perfect solution that would not arrive in time. She finished her coffee. She put on her coat and went to the barn. Stella was at the hay rack, standing square on all four legs, eating with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a cow that was entirely comfortable. Duke shifted in his stall and blew pale air through his nose in the greeting he offered her every morning. Reliable as the morning itself, the barn thermometer read 15 above. In 9 hours, it had gained a degree. Astrid forked hay. She broke the ice on the trough. She stood for a moment in the barn's small warmth and listened to the sounds of two animals doing the ordinary work of being alive, and she let herself acknowledge what she was standing in. Not triumph, not relief exactly. The feeling that sits between those two things. The feeling of a thing being precisely what you built it to be, performing precisely as you understood it, would perform holding the line between the world above and the stored warmth below exactly as designed. She had not lost a single thing. The cold broke on the 23rd of January, the way cold always breaks in that valley. Not sharply, not with any dramatic reversal that announced itself. Simply a morning when the thermometer outside the north porch read 15 below instead of 31, and that difference felt like the first breath after a long time underwater. Astrid stood on the porch in the early light and looked at the number and then looked at the sky. There were clouds to the northwest for the first time in 9 days, a thin layer moving southeast at altitude, which meant the pressure ridge had fractured and the air was moving again. Not warm air, not anything approaching warmth, but moving air was different from locked air, and different was enough for now. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did nothing for a few minutes. She sat there with both hands around the cup and the fire in the range ticking beside her, and she let the 9 days settle into the past where they belonged. Then she put it away and went to the barn. Stella was better. She had been better since the evening of the 9th day, when the barn thermometer climbed back to 14 above and held there, but better in stages is not the same as better completely. And Astrid spent the first days after the cold broke watching the cow with the same careful attention she had given her through the worst of it. She watched her eat. She watched her drink. She pressed both palms against the cow's belly each morning, reading the warmth and the movement there, the small evidence of the life Stella was carrying. The calf was still present, still generating its share of warmth from inside. Still as best Astrid could determine by feel and by Stella's behavior and appetite intact and developing as it should be. 6 weeks she had estimated on the 9th day. That put the birth in early March if her calculation was right. She began making the preparations in early February, not from anxiety, but from the same methodical attention to future requirements that governed everything she did. She deepened the bedding in Stella's stall. She moved the stored veterinary supplies closer to the stall. She kept the trough clear of ice and increased the grain ration in small increments, giving the body what it needed to do the work ahead. The roads cleared enough for travel in the last week of January. The temperature by that point had climbed back to single digits, which in the context of what had just passed felt almost moderate. Single digits was a temperature you could work in without the physics of the world changing around you. Single digits was cold, not dangerous. The distinction mattered. Oswald Fjellstad came on the 28th of January, driving his wagon down the lane in the mid-morning with the deliberate pace of a man who was not in a hurry but had a reason for coming. Astrid saw him from the kitchen window and went out to meet him in the yard. He climbed down from the wagon and stood looking at the woodshed for a moment before he said anything. Then he turned and looked at her and began to tell her what the valley looked like after 9 days. He said it without preamble in the flat, factual manner of a man reporting what he had seen. The Thorvald family to the north had lost two-thirds of their root cellar stores. Their cellar had gone below freezing on the fifth day and held there. A farmer named Hess, 8 miles east along the main road, had lost 3 head of cattle. The barn temperature on his property had dropped to 2 above on the sixth day and stayed there. The Brackett brothers, the two younger men who farmed the 80 acres to the south, had burned through the better part of their wood supply, keeping the house livable. 3 other families in the valley had come through intact, but depleted their stores, reduced to margins that left no room for a late-season cold snap in March if one arrived. Oswald delivered all of this the way he delivered everything, without embellishment, without editorial comment, in the voice of a man who believed that facts were sufficient and that adding feeling to them was redundant. When he was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your stores came through." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. He said, "Your cow." She said, "She's fine. She's carrying a calf. Early March, I think." Something moved across his face. The timing of it, the fact that Stella had been carrying a calf through those 9 days through the barn, dropping to 7 above through everything Astrid had done in the dark and the cold to keep her alive, added a weight to the story that he was absorbing slowly. He looked at the woodshed again. He said, "That pickaxe and the boot. Have you looked into who dug there before you?" Astrid had thought about this through the final days of the cold snap and the first days after it broke. She told Oswald what she had found: the depth at which the objects were embedded, the angle of the pickaxe head consistent with someone who had been standing in the pit and swinging into the elm to loosen stone, someone who had already been down there, already at depth, still working. She told him she had left everything where it was. Oswald was quiet through all of this. When she finished, he looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said, "I know who started that hole." His name was Halvar Ness. Oswald said it carefully, as though the name was a thing that deserved careful handling. He had come to that part of Minnesota from Telemark, Norway, in 1891, which was a fact that settled something in Astrid's chest she had not known was unsettled. He had purchased the original property that included what was now her 80 acres, and he had worked it for 2 seasons before the winter of 1893 took him. He had been sick going into that winter. The kind of sickness that a man who is busy and determined does not fully acknowledge until it has become something he can no longer work around. He died in January of that year on the property in the farmhouse that had since been torn down and replaced. He had no family in Minnesota other than a young son, barely 4 years old, who had made the crossing with him from Norway after Ness's wife died the previous year in Telemark. After Ness died, a neighbor family took the boy through the winter. The land reverted to the county and was sold at auction, and the boy was sent back to relatives in Norway the following spring. The land changed hands twice more before Astrid and Torsten bought it in 1924. The child's boot in the wall of the pit was the boy's. Ness had brought his son down into the excavation with him in those final working days of the autumn of 1892. The way fathers bring small children to work when there is no one else to watch them, setting him to play in the corner while he swung the mattock. The boot had slipped off the child's foot and lodged in the earth wall, and in the way of small things lost in a working day, it had simply stayed there when they climbed out for the last time. Oswald said, "My father told me Ness understood something about this ground that nobody else around here understood at the time. That the deep soil in certain places held its heat through the winter in a while the shallow cellars couldn't match. He had been trying to build something to use that. My father didn't know the details of it, just that Ness had started digging somewhere in the outbuildings and that he died before he got far enough to know whether it would work." He stopped. He looked at the woodshed. He said, "I never thought about it again until I watched you dig last September." Astrid stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the woodshed and thought about Halvar Ness from Telemark, Norway, who had come to this same valley, purchased this same land, looked at this same ground and understood the same things she had understood, who had started the same work in the same place and carried a pickaxe down into the earth and swung it against the clay until something stopped him, who had brought his small son down into the unfinished pit on a cool autumn morning and lost the boy's boot in the wall and never come back to retrieve it. She thought about the chain of it. Nessie, who had learned it somewhere from someone in Telemark or on the crossing or in those first 2 seasons of watching this particular ground behave in the particular way it behaved. Her father, who had pressed his palm against a stone wall in Telemark and told a 9-year-old girl that the earth remembered summer longer than people did. Some tradition of knowledge, older than either of them, carried in the practical memory of people who lived close enough to the ground to observe what it did and careful enough to ask why. The knowledge had been here before her. It had been in this valley on this property 40 years before she arrived. It had come within arm's reach of completion, and then the man who carried it had died, and the land had changed hands, and no one who came after had known what was unfinished beneath the ground. She was not the origin of anything. She was not the discoverer of a principle. She was the person who had arrived at the right place at the right time, with the right preparation and the willingness to finish what someone else had been forced to leave undone. She said to Oswald he knew it would work. He just didn't have enough time. Oswald said no, he didn't. She said, I want to put something with those objects, something that says who finished it and when. Oswald said, I think that's right. That afternoon, Astrid went down into the pit with a lamp and a piece of oil comb and a short length of cedar shingle on which she had written 4 lines with a carpenter's pencil, pressing hard so the marks would last. She folded the oilcloth twice around the shingle and wedged it into the earth beside the rusted pickaxe head, between the stone course and the wall face, where the damp could not reach it easily, and where anyone who found the pickaxe would find the shingle too. She had written H. Ness began this. A. Valen finished it, January 1931. The ground holds. She climbed back up and replaced the hatch and stacked the birch and went inside. March arrived the way March arrives in northern Minnesota, tentatively, with frequent reminders that it had not yet fully committed to the position. There were mornings of single digits and afternoons of 20 above, and one late-season storm that put 8 inches of new snow on ground that had been hoping to see something else. But the light was changing. The angle of the sun was changing. The days were getting longer in increments that were measurable if you were paying attention, and Astrid was always paying attention. On the 9th of March at 4 in the morning, Stella began the work that Astrid had been preparing for since February. She was in the barn at the first sign, which was not a sound, but a change in the cow's posture that she had been watching for during her late evening checks. She stayed through the night in the barn in the cold that had by then moderated to the merely uncomfortable range of the low teens, with a lamp and the supplies she had organized in February, and the knowledge accumulated from years of calving on that property and her father's farm before it. The calf was born at 6:30 in the morning, in the first pale light of a March dawn that came through the east-facing barn window in a thin bar and fell across the straw-covered floor of Stella's stall. A bull calf, strong from the first moment, finding his feet with the determined, slightly indignant urgency of a newborn animal that has places to be. He was dark across the back and lighter on the flanks, the same coloring as Stella, and he weighed by Astrid's practiced estimation somewhere close to 90 pounds. She cleaned him and got him to Stella and stepped back and watched him find what he needed. Then she sat on the stall rail for a moment and looked at the two of them in the early morning light and felt something she did not have a name for. Not joy exactly, though there was that in it. Not relief, though there was that too. Something older than either of those things. The feeling of a life that has continued when it might not have, of a thread that has held when the tension on it was more than it had any reasonable right to withstand. She named him Harold, a name from Telemark, a name that belonged to that valley in Norway and now belonged to this valley in Minnesota, carried across the water by a woman who had brought nothing with her that did not earn its passage. In the spring of 1931, Oswald Fjellstad came to Astrid's farm 4 times. The first time to return the provisions she had given him in January, replaced in kind no more and no less, because he was a man who paid his debts precisely. The second time with his oldest son, a young man of about 22, who had his father's build and his father's deliberate way of moving through work, carrying a notebook and a set of careful questions that they worked through over the better part of an afternoon. Oswald had decided to build his own pit. He was building it under the south end of his equipment shed, which was the best available location on his property, given the configuration of his buildings and the lay of his ground. He had questions about depth, about stone selection, about the composition of the roof layers, about the placement of the hatch relative to the prevailing wind. He asked each question in the direct manner of a man who understood that the answers had been arrived at by experience, and that experience was worth more than his own speculation. Astrid answered each question with the same directness. She explained the reasoning behind each decision as well as the decision itself, because a person who only knows what to do without knowing why cannot adapt when the conditions differ from the example. Oswald's son wrote everything in his notebook with the careful attention of someone who understood he was writing down something that would outlast the conversation. They broke ground on the Fjellstad pit in the last week of April when the frost was out of the soil to a depth sufficient to work. The pit was finished by the middle of June and held its first season's stores by September. The Brackett brothers came to Astrid in July with a more general kind of question. They wanted to understand the principle, not the specific dimensions or the specific materials, but the principle, the reason it worked, the logic underneath the construction. They were younger men, somewhere in their late 20s, and they approached the question with the directness of people who have recently been taught something by events that they would rather have learned some other way. Astrid sat with them on her porch on a July evening when the air was warm and the light was long and the valley smelled of cut hay and creek water, and she explained it from the beginning. She explained what she had observed about the ground under the woodshed over 5 years of watching it. She explained the thermal mass principle, the way stone absorbs and releases heat, the way depth insulates against surface temperature, swings, the way an enclosed and protected subsoil location maintains a temperature that the surrounding air cannot overcome within the span of a single winter season. She explained what her father had shown her in Telemark in 1908 and what Oswald had told her about Halvar Ness and what she had found in the east wall of her own pit in January of that year. She told them about Ness because she thought it mattered that they know. She thought it mattered that the knowledge have a history, that it not appear to begin with her, that they understand they were receiving something that had been understood by other people before them and carried imperfectly through time and almost lost entirely and recovered by a chain of small moments of attention. The pickaxe head in the wall, the child's boot, a father's palm pressed against a stone wall in Norway, a woman walking 3 miles to ask a neighbor why his father's cellar had never failed. The Brackett brothers broke ground on their pit in August and had it finished and stocked by the first week of October. By the end of 1931, 5 properties in the Crow Wing Valley had a pit of the type Astrid had built. By the end of 1932, there were 3 more. The dimensions varied with the available space and the ground conditions. The materials varied with what each property had to hand, but the principle was consistent across all of them because the principle had been explained carefully and the reasoning behind it had been transmitted along with the instructions so that when conditions differed from the example, the people working in those conditions could adapt. None of this was written down. There was no document, no diagram, no published account. It moved the way practical knowledge has always moved in rural communities, from a person who knows to a person who needs to know, in conversation, in demonstration, in the kind of explanation that includes the why alongside the what. It was the same mechanism by which Astrid's father had taught her and his father before him had taught him, and Halvar Ness had carried the knowledge across the Atlantic to a Minnesota valley where it had waited 40 years for someone to complete it. The years that followed were not easy years because the years of the 1930s were not easy years for anyone in that part of the country. The Depression tightened around rural communities with a particular thoroughness, cutting prices for what farmers produced while leaving the costs of what they needed largely unchanged. There were springs when the math of a farming operation did not resolve into any comfortable number, regardless of how many times you worked through it. Astrid managed. She managed because she had built systems that reduced her dependence on the variables she could not control. She managed because she had understood from the beginning that the enemy of a small farm in a hard climate is not any single catastrophe, but the accumulated small losses that add up over seasons into a deficit that cannot be recovered. The pit eliminated one category of loss entirely: the careful management of her wood supply, the obsessive attention to the condition of her equipment, the discipline of her seed selection and soil rotation. These were not dramatic interventions. They were the steady application of thought to every aspect of the operation, the refusal to accept that something failed because it was supposed to fail. She was not rich. She was not comfortable by the standards of people who measure comfort by what they possess. But she did not go hungry in the 1930s, and she did not lose her property, and she did not ask for help except in the specific and reciprocal way that neighboring farmers in a functioning community ask for help. The way you ask for an extra set of hands at the hay harvest in exchange for yours at the grain harvest. The way you lend a piece of equipment you are not using to someone who needs it and accept the same in return. Harold grew into a steer of good size and was sold in the autumn of 1932. Stella produced 2 more calves in the years that followed, both healthy, both carried through Minnesota winters in the barn that Astrid kept with increasing skill and attention. The hatch beneath the woodshed was lifted and lowered through 11 more seasons, the provisions going down each September and coming up as needed through each winter, the temperature inside holding its steady ground through cold snaps and blizzards in the particular grinding cold of February in that latitude. She improved the pit twice. The first improvement extended the stone floor 2 feet to the east, adding thermal mass she had concluded was insufficient after the most extreme cold nights of that first real test. The second improvement came after a summer when condensation had worked into the hay layer of the roof, compressing it and reducing its insulating value. She replaced the hay with packed dry moss from the north woodlot, carried in burlap sacks, over several late summer mornings, layered with the same careful density she had given the hay. The moss held its structure, better breathed more evenly, and did not compress under the weight of the soil above it. In the spring of 1948, Astrid sold the 80 acres to a young couple from Wisconsin. She was 50 years old. She had been on that property for 24 years alone for the last 19 of them, and she had managed it well in every year she had been there. But her eyes had been giving her trouble for 2 seasons, and there was a niece in Duluth who had written several times asking her to come, and the truth she allowed herself to face in the winter of 1947 was that the farm required more from her than she had to give it. Not yet, not dramatically, but moving in that direction. And she was not a woman who waited for a situation to become a crisis before she responded to it. She negotiated the sale herself at a price she considered fair for the land and the structures on it, and she asked no premium for the knowledge she was leaving behind. She packed what was hers and arranged for Duke's successor, a gelding she had kept for 6 years, to go to Oswald's son, who had room for him and would use him well. On her last evening on the property, she went to the woodshed for the final time. She moved the birch. She lifted the hatch. She climbed down the 8 steps in the lamplight, which was the same lamp she had used every time she had come down into the pit, its glass smoky from years of use, but still functional, still casting the same warm, uneven light across the stone walls and the earth floor and the moss and canvas ceiling. She stood at the bottom and held her bare palm at chest height. The reading was the same as it had always been. Mid-November, and the ground was holding what the summer had given it giving it back into the cool air of the pit at the same steady, unhurried rate it had always maintained. It had not changed, not in 19 years of use, not in the warmest summers or the coldest winters that the valley could provide. The principle did not vary with the season. The principle was simply true the way the true things are consistently and without requiring maintenance or belief. She looked at the east wall at the place where the pickaxe head and the child's boot sat behind the stone course alongside the oilcloth-wrapped cedar shingle she had placed there in 1931. She had checked on the shingle twice in subsequent years, and it was intact both times, the pencil marks still clear on the cedar, the oilcloth still holding. She climbed back up. She did not replace the hatch because the next time someone opened it should be the people who would be living here now, who should find it waiting for them as she had built it open and available and already holding its temperature. She left the lamp on the ledge inside the door. She stacked the birch back into its rows for the last time, each split piece returned to its place by hands that had done this motion so many thousands of times it required no attention. Then she walked to the house and finished packing. The young couple from Wisconsin found the pit in their second winter on the property. The husband was reorganizing the firewood in December and moved the third row from the right and felt the leather pull strap under his boot and lifted it without knowing what he was lifting and found 8 steps descending into the earth and an oil lamp on the ledge and a cool, still earth-smelling darkness below. They wrote to Astrid in Duluth asking what it was and what it was for and who had built it and whether they should be concerned about the structural integrity of the woodshed floor. She wrote back, 3 paragraphs in the clear and economical handwriting she had used all her life on 2 sheets of plain paper. She explained the principle. She explained the construction, the stone walls, and the heated floor, and the moss and canvas roof, and the 9 feet of depth that separated the stored warmth below from the killing cold above. She told them about Halvar Ness, who had started it in 1892, and about the pickaxe head in the child's boot in the oilcloth shingle they would find if they looked in the east wall behind the stone course. She told them it had held through 9 days of 38 below zero in January of 1931, without failing, and that in her estimation, the structural integrity of the woodshed floor was sound because she had built it to be sound and had checked it every year for 19 years. She told them to load it in September. Root vegetables in burlap, never plastic. Stone crocks for anything salted or fermented. Nothing in cardboard. Keep the hatch seated firmly and the birch stacked over it, and do not let the moss layer get wet. The last paragraph read, "The earth remembers summer longer than we do. It takes months to cool. Once you understand that winter stops being the enemy, you are not fighting the cold. You are borrowing what the ground already has." My father told me this in Telemark, Norway, in the autumn of 1908. I am telling you now in the hope that you will tell someone else. They used the pit every winter for 30 years. They loaded it each September and pulled from it each January and February and into March when the weather required it, and in 30 years of use, it did not fail them once. The moss layer held, the stone walls held, the cedar shingle in the east wall stayed dry and legible behind its oilcloth wrapping. The temperature inside varied by no more than 2 or 3 degrees across the worst winters that the Crow Wing Valley produced in those 3 decades, always within the range Astrid had designed and for always within the range of what the ground was willing to give. Their daughter grew up helping load it. She learned to select the firmest potatoes for long storage and to check the wax seals on the crocks before they went down, and to lift the hatch carefully so the cold air from above did not rush in and disturb the stable temperature below. She learned to read what the pit was doing the same way Astrid had read it, with a bare hand held at chest height and patience enough to let the reading come to you rather than reaching for it. She described it once to a neighbor who had asked about her family's food storage the way people do when they notice that some households seem less affected by hard winters than others. She thought for a moment about how to explain it and then said it is the most reliable thing on the property. More reliable than the furnace, more reliable than the road, more reliable than the weather forecast. We have had furnaces break down and roads closed for days and forecasts that were wrong by 20 degrees in either direction. The pit has never been wrong. Not once. Not in any winter I can remember. The neighbor asked how it worked. She explained the principle. The thermal mass, the depth, the insulation, the way the earth absorbs the heat of summer and releases it through winter at a rate slow enough that no single cold snap, however severe, can overcome it before the season turns. She explained it in the words she had grown up hearing, the words her parents had used when they explained it to her, which were close to the words Astrid had used in her letter, which were close to the words Astrid's father had used on a stone staircase in Telemark in the autumn of 1908. She explained it completely, and the neighbor listened, and then the neighbor asked who figured that out. The daughter thought about this. She thought about her parents finding the pit in December of their second winter. She thought about the letter from Duluth. She thought about the name on the oilcloth shingle in the east wall that she had read as a child and read again as an adult and read once more the previous autumn when she was checking the moss layer before the season's loading. She said a woman named Astrid Veland. She built it in 1929. But there was a man named Halvar Ness who started it before her in 1892 on the same ground. He didn't get to finish it. The neighbor asked, and before him, the daughter said, I don't know, but it goes back further than him. It goes back to Norway, I think. Maybe further than that. It's old knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge that doesn't have a beginning you can point to. It just keeps getting passed along. She paused for a moment, looking at the woodshed across her yard in the October light. She said the thing about it is it only keeps working if you tell someone how it works. The knowing is only useful while someone is carrying it. The minute nobody is carrying it anymore, it disappears. And then someone has to start over, and they might not have as much time as they need, and something gets lost. She looked back at her neighbor. She said so, I'm telling you.